I have already marked out the teeth that are missing with an X through them so that I don't get confused with my design. And let's go ahead and draw our design. We indicated that this is a Kennedy Class 3, so it's going to be a totally tooth-supported RPD. And we need to have rest next to or near each edentulous space. So I have an edentulous space here, so I'm going to want at least a rest on the mesial of this molar and the distal of this premolar. Now, because I don't have any distal undercuts in this area, I have to utilize one of these undercuts on the mesial surface of it. And I would like to have my worst undercut to be my direct retainer, which was right here. So in order to get to that point with a direct retainer, I have to come from back in this direction. So I'm going to have what's called a ring clasp. And I put another rest back here, and I will be coming around like this to grab that tooth. That is also true on the other side, so I'm going to go ahead and make a mesial and a distal rest on that last tooth that I'm going to put a direct clasp bar or clasp assembly on. And ideally, I would like to separate retention as much as possible. So ideally, I would have liked to have had direct retainers or undercuts on either of these surfaces to separate my retention and prevent that from rotating in this direction. But I can't do that. On my premolars, though, I'm going to have a distal rest, and then I'm going to come forward with a direct retainer to the mesial, facial on both of these premolars. Now, in addition to that, if I did my major connector all the way from back here, all the way around to here, it's a pretty good distance. So it would be nice to have an additional rest for support of a really long major connector. So I'm going to put a rest on the mesial of this premolar. I could have put it on the canine and created a composite cingulum rest and placed it on there. It might be a little more aesthetic in that position. I could do a distal incisal angle rest, but it's not very aesthetic and often involves a problem with occlusion with the opposing arch. The mesial fossa of the first premolar gets it off the incisal edge and makes it a little more aesthetic, and this usually doesn't have much occlusion in it, which makes it a very good placement of a rest, and you don't usually have to do too much tooth modification in order to have that rest. So let's go ahead and work on our design here. So I'm going to place my framework around that rest. I'm going to have a ring clasp. So the upper border, as I come off here, will come back, and it will become the rest in this area, and it will become the upper border of my direct retainer arm that comes forward. And that direct retainer arm, then I would be coming back. It becomes the bottom or the guiding plate area there, and it will come forward, and it will go down to become a guide plate right there. This one will go down the surface and become a guide plate. Note that this little rest here, I'm going to put a crosshatch on it so I know it's my direct retainer position. It does not connect to this rest here. It is not a complete ring. This is like one of those little dime store rings. It's not connected so it'll fit any tooth, and it can flex. If it's solid and connected here into an undercut, it can't even get into the undercut. So keep that in mind. All right. We have three options here. We can either do base attachment, we could do a metal tooth, we could do a tube tooth in this area. But we'll do just our regular base attachment, which comes down and it is large enough to replace a tooth at least the size of the tooth that is removed. And so my base attachment comes down like this. and it will go around this rest. It will become the direct retainer on that premolar. It will come down and back down, and then it comes across here and back up, and it'll have some holes in it for retention of that denture tooth. This is going to be my direct retainer on the premolar. So as this rest also comes down around here, it will come back, and it will be a reciprocal component, because every clasp assembly must have a direct retainer. It must have a reciprocal component. It has a minor connector, and it has a rest. So I'm going to come on around here and plate this first premolar and circle my rest on this side. Now, as that comes down through here, it's going to be a rest there. It comes down, and it is going to be lingual plating, because I've decided that I'm doing a lingual plate because I didn't have enough room for a lingual bar between the marginal gingiva and the functional floor of the mouth. So I had to have a lingual plate. The plating comes from contact point to contact point, and it is above the cingulum. Doesn't come all the way up to the incisal edge, but it does cover the cingulum and scallops from contact point to contact point on around here like this. And then this will become my reciprocal component that will come down, and will have base attachment in that area also. So we're going to dip down, leave enough room for a tooth to set in there that's at least the size of the regular tooth. And it will come around this rest. Now it's also going to come back. No, I'm getting a little carried away here. Hold on a minute. It's not going to come back like that. It is going to come around this rest. It is going to become the reciprocal component coming backwards like this. It will go around this rest, and it will come forward and become my direct retainer like this. And I will have a little hatch there to determine that's the point of my direct retention. This arm, as it comes around here, goes around the rest. The bottom part of this becomes a little bit of a guide plate right along the base of that tooth, and there's a little guide plate there going down to become this base attachment. Basement attachment comes on over, and it will become a guide plate right over here, and we'll have a lot of circles in here to provide retention. It isn't a number of holes based on number of teeth missing, it's just number of holes to hold that denture tooth in place. And this will become our direct retainer here, and come back here and join our guide plate. And this is our direct retention on this side. So we need to have, we've got the top part of our major connector drawn all the way around, but we need to have a lower border to our major connector. So at this guide plate area, this will come down. It will need to be at least 5 millimeters in this area. It will come around, and our major connector is going to come all the way back to our guide plate area right there. So this is a major connector all along here. You want this at the functional floor of the mouth. You want it as low as possible so that the tongue doesn't get drawn to there and play with that bottom border, which happens to be a little bit on the thicker side and is annoying to patients. So here we have this. Now, let's draw our plastic. Our plastic is going to come down here, and we'll have a little flange right here. That plastic comes up and over and it actually is right in front of this external finish line that we have drawn right here. This is the external finish line. We also have an internal finish line, which would be on the tissue side, that finishes off right here in this same area when we have base attachment. That's not true with some of the other replacements. With a tube tooth, the internal finish, the external finish line is solid here, and then our acrylic is on the inside, and on the inside with a circle right in that area. We'll show you a couple in a minute. Also on this side, we're going to have an internal finish line. That's where the plastic joins the major connector. People get finish lines all screwed up. They have a hard time with them. So this is our base attachment, and our base coming down like this. The base comes up. It will form a butt joint right along here with our external finish line, and then there will also be an internal finish line where the major connector joins the plastic on the inside. So if I'm not mistaken, that's pretty much our design. Let's check that out. I do have one little flaw. If you notice on our cast, we have some diastemas here. And if we come straight across, you'll be able to see that dark metal through there. So next to these two, we would have dipped down just a little bit with our major connector. Avoid that diastema. Come right down to the base of the tooth. We can't go much farther because this would be too thin. So that's the only change I would make to this design that we have right now. Your instructor may teach you that it is better to have buckle, 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 buckle retention if possible. And that is true, but when you do that, you're going to have a lot more metal right here with the major connector coming posteriorly farther and plating this back tooth and coming forward with our direct retainer. So if this tooth leans a lot to the lingual, then that means this has to stand out away from the tissues more. So you need to think about that when you do the design. If there's not a problem of this having to stand out far from the tissues, it's not a problem. This particular design calls for our major connector to come all the way back to the distal of the last tooth that we have used as an abutment. It will plate that tooth, and then it is in essence sort of a ring clasp, but the ring clasp is, you know, an arm that comes all the way around here. This is just plated, and then the arms come forward to grab the mesiofacial of this particular abutment tooth. We haven't really made a change in the rest of the design. One other change that is a little different, I'm showing you the metal tooth where you have a rest and then the guide plate comes down and it becomes the front line of the metal tooth, and you label outside in this area called metal tooth. Evidently, when you use a metal tooth, aesthetics is not an issue because the entire occlusal surface will be metal. When you use base attachment, the entire occlusal surfaces will be denture teeth. And the rest of that design is in good condition. This also assumes that this molar is in good condition and this molar is in good condition and going to be left for a long period of time. Another variation of this design is when you plan for a tooth to be lost. For instance, let's say this third molar has some periodontal condition. It's maybe crown to root ratio is not great, but at this point it's pretty solid in the mouth, but you know that in the future it's going to be lost. One way that you can design a partial so that it becomes a free end or an extension base, meaning all of these teeth on this side are missing. If you're planning for that to happen, then what we do that is different is that instead of our major connector coming back all the way to this posterior area, we stop and we put an external finish line down at this distal lingual line angle, and we end our major connector right there. We then swing up a little bit for our base attachment and bring it back, and we have base attachment all in this area instead of major connector with just a small area of base attachment. So what happens is, then when this tooth is lost, the acrylic resin can just be extended back, cover retromolar pad, and you haven't lost your partial denture. Well, when we do that, the other thing we ought to really think about is what kind of a clasp assembly is kind to this abutment tooth. We're going to then have torquing on this abutment tooth. So at the time we design our partial for this type of design, then we should maybe think about a mesial rest, a distal guide plate, and an eye bar on that tooth, so that when this tooth is lost, this becomes the ideal clasping mechanism for our partial denture, which now becomes a Kennedy Class 2 or an extension base, where this will go up and down on soft tissue, and this tooth would receive some torquing forces. At that point, too, we would definitely want to have this rest up in here because it would act as an indirect retainer for our design, preventing this partial to lift up when the patient eats sticky foods back here. So this is the way we would design if the tooth is going to be lost. External finish line, come back around here. This has to be a minimum of 5 millimeters in thickness. This has to avoid the marginal gingiva, a minimum of 3 to 4 millimeters. And we'd have then an internal acrylic fillet finish line, as well as this would be our acrylic that comes around like this. Now, what's the advantage of, say, metal framework coming back here like this versus base attachment with acrylic? This will be a lot thinner to the patient on the lingual side and will appear or feel less bulky than when you finish it like this with acrylic, because you have to have room for base attachment, you have to have room for plastic on top of it, and it becomes more bulky. So there are some advantages to having just that thin partial, but if the tooth is questionable but you want to use it for a period of time, that's the way you design it. On this side we did a tube tooth, and with the tube tooth we have an external finish line and an external finish line out here from guide plate to guide plate, guide plate to guide plate, leaving enough room to put a tooth in there the size of that molar. Then it has a round circle in the middle representing the tube that's going up, and then we label it TT for tube tooth. We don't have to write white occlusal, but what I'm trying to indicate is that the tube tooth would have a white occlusal surface, whereas the metal tooth will be an all silver tooth that is waxed with the framework and would not be as aesthetic as the other option. This drawing is showing something a little bit different also. This is showing that, let's say we did have at least 8 millimeters between the marginal gingiva and the functional floor of the mouth, then we would probably wish to place a lingual bar major connector. And this shows you the design where we're coming from the rest, we're coming down away from the marginal gingiva avoiding it by at least 3 millimeters, and then coming back up. Also, this one was drawn with the idea that that tooth is going to be lost sometime later. So again, this had the external finish line here. You could also plate all the way back to there as we did on some of the others. This also would require 5 millimeter in width lingual bar for strength of this type of design. Also, if a tooth is severely tipped to the mesial, sometimes we can't even put clasp arms on there, but what we think about doing is placing a really long occlusal rest on a tooth that's extremely tipped, because when there's forces coming down on this denture tooth, then this tooth wants to pull and lean forward more. If you have that long rest all the way across the occlusal surface, it can't tip because it's sort of trapped from front to back from being able to tip any farther. So that's something else that you would want to consider. Our last variation here is just to show you how you would handle it if you had a Kennedy Class 3 and you had some anterior teeth missing. Very commonly, the four incisors are missing. So if you had anterior teeth missing, the point being that you have to have an additional rest next to or near the edentulous area. Every edentulous area has to have a rest next to or near it for support. When you bite down, if you don't have a rest until way back here, then what the patient feels is that this lingual plate is kind of pushing those teeth forward. So that was to remind you, that's if you had an anterior edentulous area on the same thing. The other thing that it does show is that sometimes this little tooth leans so far to the lingual and so far to the mesial that you can't even put a direct retainer or a reciprocal component on that lingual. You'd have to mutilate the tooth in order to grind it to fit your circumstances, in which case you would use at least a very long occlusal rest